There is a sentence that has been read aloud, out loud, in a circle of strangers, at the start of more recovery meetings than almost any other sentence in the English language, in basements and church halls and hospital rooms, by people who have nothing else in common except the exact same problem. And it doesn't begin with comfort. It begins with a warning that some of the people in that room, despite everything, despite the honesty and the desperation and the willingness to try, are still going to fail. Not because the solution doesn't work, but because they will refuse to fully give themselves to it. That warning, delivered in the opening lines of this chapter, is precisely why it has endured for nearly a century as the single most important chapter in the entire book, the one chapter that gets read aloud, word for word, at meetings all over the world, every single day. By the time the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous reached the point of actually writing down the method that had worked for them, they had already spent years watching other approaches fail, not occasionally, but with a consistency that had become almost predictable. They had watched men attempt sobriety through willpower alone and fail. They had watched men attempt it through medical treatment alone and fail. They had watched men attempt it through half-hearted religious gestures, going through the motions without any real internal shift, and fail in exactly the same way as everyone else. What this chapter set out to do was something far more demanding than simply offering encouragement or general advice. It set out to lay down, in specific and unflinching terms, exactly what had actually worked and exactly what level of honesty and willingness that work required. The chapter opens by directly confronting a temptation that nearly every struggling alcoholic brings into recovery, whether they admit it or not. The hope that there might be an easier, softer version of this process, some way to get the benefits of sobriety without fully engaging with the more uncomfortable parts of the method. The chapter states, without softening the message in any way, that those who cling to this hope typically do not recover, not because the fellowship turns them away, but because half measures, by their very nature, tend to produce half results, and half results, against a condition as relentless as real alcoholism, are rarely enough to hold. This uncompromising honesty is followed immediately by something that balances it, a description of exactly who this method is for, and who it is not necessarily for. The chapter is careful to distinguish between people who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves, a small group for whom the method described here may genuinely not be sufficient, and the vast majority of struggling alcoholics who, whatever their other flaws and however many times they had previously failed, retained the basic capacity for rigorous honesty once they were finally willing to use it. This distinction mattered enormously to readers approaching this chapter with a lifetime of accumulated shame, because it reframed the requirement not as some impossibly high moral standard reserved for saints, but as something ordinary, flawed human beings, exactly like the men who had written this book, had already proven capable of meeting. From there, the chapter moves into what became its most consequential contribution, not just to the recovery of individual alcoholics, but to an entire field of addiction treatment that would grow up around it in the decades that followed. A specific, sequential path, 12 distinct stages, each building directly on the one before it, describing precisely what these early members had actually done, in the order they had actually done it, to move from complete hopelessness into lasting sobriety. The path begins with an admission that sounds, on its surface, almost like a defeat, and that many newcomers initially resist with everything they have. An honest acknowledgement that they were entirely without power over alcohol, and that their lives, as a direct result of that powerlessness, had become genuinely unmanageable. This starting point was never intended as an exercise in self-pity or despair. It was intended as the single most important act of honesty a struggling alcoholic could perform, the demolition of the last remaining illusion, the belief that with just a little more willpower or a slightly better strategy, control could still somehow be reclaimed. Only once that illusion was fully and honestly abandoned, the chapter insists, could any real progress actually begin. Out of that admission of powerlessness came the second stage of the path, a shift toward the possibility of hope rather than continued despair. A growing conviction that some power greater than the individual's own will might be capable of restoring order to a life that individual effort alone had already proven incapable of managing. This step deliberately avoided prescribing any specific definition of that power, building directly on the openness described earlier in the book for readers still wrestling with skepticism about traditional religious language. What mattered here wasn't the specific content of belief, but the direction of it, a turning away from pure self-reliance and toward the possibility that help existed somewhere beyond the individual's own exhausted resources. The third stage translated that growing belief into a concrete, deliberate decision, a conscious choice to turn one's will and one's life over to the care of that higher power. However each individual person had come to understand it. This wasn't described as a single dramatic gesture performed once and then forgotten. It was described as a decision that had to be renewed, in practice, again and again, especially in the early and most difficult stages of recovery, when old patterns of self-reliant thinking would inevitably resurface and need to be consciously set aside once more. With this foundation in place, the path turned inward, toward a stage that many of the early members described as the most uncomfortable of the entire process. A searching and fearless moral inventory, an honest and thorough accounting of one's own conduct, resentments, fears, and harmful patterns, written down and examined without the usual self-serving distortions that had allowed so much of this behavior to go unexamined for years. This wasn't framed as an exercise in self-punishment. It was framed as necessary excavation, the only way to identify exactly which patterns of thinking and behavior had been quietly feeding the drinking all along, patterns that could not be addressed honestly until they were first named honestly. The fifth stage took that private inventory and made it social, insisting on something that ran directly against the instinct toward secrecy that had protected so many alcoholics from full accountability for years. Admitting the exact nature of one's wrongs, not only privately to oneself and to a higher power, but out loud to another human being. This stage carried enormous psychological weight in the accounts of the earliest members, many of whom described a profound and immediate sense of relief the moment they finally spoke their most shameful secrets aloud to another person and discovered, often for the first time in years, that they were still accepted afterward, rather than rejected. The stages that followed built directly on this foundation of honest self-examination, moving from insight toward genuine transformation. There was a stage requiring complete readiness to have these identified character defects removed altogether, followed by the humble request that a higher power actually do so, a sequence that emphasized once again that lasting change was not something the alcoholic could manufacture through willpower alone, but something that required ongoing reliance on a source of strength beyond the self. From there, the path turned toward repair of the damage already done to other people, beginning with the compilation of a complete list of everyone who had been harmed along the way, and a growing willingness to make amends to all of them. This was followed by the actual making of those amends, wherever possible, except in cases where doing so would cause further injury to the very people the alcoholic was trying to make things right with. This particular qualification mattered enormously to the early members, because it prevented amends from becoming another form of self-centered behavior, dressed up as repentance but actually causing fresh harm in the name of the alcoholic's own need for absolution. The path then turned toward maintenance, recognizing something the earliest members understood with painful clarity from their own repeated failures, that recovery was never a single achievement completed once and then permanently secured, but an ongoing condition requiring continuous attention. This meant continuing to take personal inventory on an ongoing basis, and promptly admitting it whenever new wrongs were identified, rather than allowing old patterns of self-justification and denial to quietly creep back in over time. The 11th stage of the path turned toward the deepening and sustaining of the spiritual connection established earlier. Through ongoing prayer and reflection, seeking a clearer understanding of that higher power's will and the strength to carry it out. And the final stage, the one that gave the entire fellowship its distinctive character and its remarkable staying power across generations, described what happened once a person had genuinely undergone this transformation. Having experienced this kind of spiritual awakening as a direct result of these stages, the natural and necessary response was to carry this same message to other alcoholics still suffering, and to practice these principles in every part of daily life, not just in the specific context of drinking. This final stage deserves particular attention because it circles directly back to the discovery Bill Wilson had made almost by accident in that Akron hotel lobby years earlier. That helping another struggling alcoholic wasn't simply an act of generosity performed after recovery was complete. It was, in a very real and practical sense, part of how recovery was sustained in the first place. The chapter makes clear that this entire sequence was never intended to be worked once and then set aside as a completed task. It described an ongoing way of living, one that had to be actively maintained day after day, precisely because the underlying condition it addressed had never actually disappeared, only lost its former grip. What makes this chapter so distinctive, even reading it today, is the complete absence of vague or comfortable language anywhere within it. It doesn't promise that this path will be easy. It doesn't suggest that willingness alone, without follow-through, will be sufficient. It states, plainly and repeatedly, that this process demands complete honesty, sustained effort, and a genuine willingness to examine oneself without the usual defenses that had protected the alcoholic's self-image for years. And yet, embedded within that demanding honesty is the same message of hope that runs through everything that came before it in the book, that this specific demanding path had already worked, not for one exceptional individual, but for a growing number of ordinary, deeply flawed people who had once been every bit as convinced of their own hopelessness as the reader currently holding this book. The chapter closes by returning to the same directness with which it opened, refusing to let the reader mistake this process for something abstract or merely aspirational. It insists that these stages were not offered as an interesting theory to be considered and discussed, but as a course of action to be actually taken, fully and honestly, by anyone who genuinely wanted the results that this small but growing fellowship had already begun to demonstrate were possible. This was never meant to be read once and admired from a comfortable distance. It was meant to be lived, one honest, uncomfortable, and ultimately liberating stage at a time, exactly as the men who wrote it down had already lived it themselves. As we reach the end of How It Works, we arrive at one of the most important messages in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Recovery requires more than simply wanting to change. Wanting a different life is important. Recognizing that alcohol has caused destruction is important. Admitting that we have a problem is important. But eventually, there comes a moment when we have to ask ourselves a deeper question. What am I willing to do differently? Because knowing that our life needs to change and actually beginning the process of change are two very different things. Many people spend years wishing for a different life. They wish they could stop drinking. They wish their relationships were healthier. They wish their families trusted them again. They wish they could control their emotions. They wish they could wake up without regret. They wish they could feel peace. But wishing does not automatically create transformation. At some point, willingness must become action. And that is one of the central lessons of How It Works. The program described in the Big Book is not presented as something we simply admire from a distance. It is something we are invited to practice. The steps are not merely ideas, they are a path of action. They require honesty. They require humility. They require courage. They require self-examination. They require willingness to make changes, and they require a person to become increasingly responsible for the way they live. This can be uncomfortable, because recovery asks us to look at ourselves honestly, not only at what other people have done to us, not only at the circumstances we dislike, not only at the people who hurt us, but also at our own behavior, our resentments, our fears, our selfishness, our dishonesty, our pride, our attempts to control others, our harmful actions, our patterns. And perhaps one of the most difficult things a person can do is stop defending themselves long enough to see themselves clearly. That is why honesty is so important. Without honesty, there can be no real change. If we continue lying to ourselves, we continue protecting the very behaviors that keep us trapped. We say, "It wasn't that bad. They deserved it. I only did it because they made me angry. I can handle it. I don't really need help. I'll change tomorrow." These statements may protect our pride, temporarily, but they can also protect the problem. Recovery asks for something different. It asks us to become willing to tell the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable, even when it makes us look less impressive, even when it means admitting that we were wrong, even when it means acknowledging that our behavior hurt someone. Because humility does not mean believing that we are worthless. It means becoming willing to see ourselves accurately, not better than we are, not worse than we are, simply honestly. And perhaps that is one of the most liberating experiences in recovery. You no longer have to spend all your energy pretending. You no longer have to protect an image. You no longer have to convince everyone that you are okay. You can finally say, "This is where I am." And from that point, you can begin asking, "What can I do about it?" That question changes everything. Because recovery is not about remaining trapped in guilt over the past. It is about using the truth of the past to build a different future. The steps provide a process for doing that. They encourage us to examine our lives, to recognize where we have been wrong, to become willing to change, to make amends, to continue examining ourselves, to seek spiritual growth, and to carry the message of recovery to others. This process is not designed to create perfection. It is designed to create progress, and that distinction is extremely important, because many people avoid recovery because they believe they have to become perfect. They think, "I will never be able to do everything right. I will always make mistakes. I have too many problems. I am too damaged." But recovery does not require perfection. It requires willingness. You can make mistakes and continue. You can fall short and continue. You can have difficult days and continue. You can discover something about yourself that you do not like and still continue. The goal is not to become someone who never struggles. The goal is to become someone who no longer runs away from the struggle through alcohol. That is a profound difference. Life will still happen. There will still be disappointment. There will still be conflict. There will still be loss. There will still be fear. There will still be anger. There will still be uncertainty. The difference is that recovery gives us another way to respond. Instead of escaping everything, we learn to face life. Instead of drinking over our problems, we learn to work through them. Instead of blaming everyone else, we learn to examine our own part. Instead of isolating ourselves, we learn to connect. Instead of demanding control, we learn acceptance. Instead of living only for ourselves, we discover the meaning of service. And perhaps that is why the title, How It Works, is so powerful. Because the program works through participation. It works through practice. It works through repetition. It works through honesty. It works through action. And it works through the willingness to continue even when we do not feel like continuing. There may be days when a person feels inspired. There may be days when they feel grateful. There may be days when they feel spiritually connected. But there will also be days when they feel angry, tired, confused, discouraged, tempted, and recovery must exist on those days too. Because a new life cannot depend entirely on how we feel. It must be built on principles. And perhaps that is one of the most important transitions in recovery, moving from emotion-driven living to principle-driven living. Before recovery, a person may have lived according to whatever they felt in the moment. I feel angry, so I will react. I feel lonely, so I will drink. I feel rejected, so I will isolate myself. I feel anxious, so I will escape. I feel powerful, so I will control everyone. Recovery teaches another possibility. I can feel something without allowing that feeling to control my behavior. That is maturity. You can feel anger and choose not to destroy someone. You can feel fear and still do what is right. You can feel sadness and still remain sober. You can feel resentment and still choose not to act destructively. You can feel loneliness and reach out instead of disappearing. You can feel uncertainty and still move forward. This is where recovery becomes much larger than simply abstaining from alcohol. It becomes a transformation in how a person lives. And perhaps that is why the spiritual dimension is so important. The alcoholic who once believed everything depended on personal control begins learning another way. They begin recognizing that they do not have to carry the entire world on their shoulders. They can ask for help, they can pray, they can meditate, they can listen, they can trust, they can serve, they can become part of a fellowship. They can become willing to let something greater than their own ego guide their decisions. And perhaps one of the greatest changes occurs when the question changes from, "What do I want?" to, "What is the right thing for me to do?" That question can transform relationships. It can transform families. It can transform friendships. It can transform work. It can transform service. Because recovery is not simply about getting what we want. It is about learning how to live responsibly. And responsibility can be difficult. Sometimes the right thing is not the easiest thing. Sometimes we have to apologize. Sometimes we have to admit that we were wrong. Sometimes we have to accept that someone may never forgive us. Sometimes we have to walk away from situations that are unhealthy. Sometimes we have to stop trying to control another person. Sometimes we have to accept consequences. Sometimes we have to begin again. But every time we choose honesty over deception, responsibility over blame, and action over excuses, we strengthen the new life we are building. And perhaps this is one of the greatest lessons of how it works. Recovery is built through thousands of small decisions. Not only through dramatic moments, not only through emotional experiences, but through ordinary choices. Getting out of bed, going to a meeting, calling another alcoholic, keeping a promise, telling the truth, making an apology, doing the right thing when nobody is watching, helping someone else, practicing patience, letting go of resentment, accepting what cannot be changed. These small decisions accumulate, and over time, they create a different person, a different relationship with life, a different relationship with others, and eventually, perhaps, a different relationship with oneself. The person who once hated themselves begins to respect themselves, not because they have become perfect, but because they are finally living in alignment with their values. That is powerful, because self-respect is not created by pretending to be better than you are. It is created by becoming honest about who you are and then doing the work necessary to grow. And perhaps that is why willingness is so central. You cannot force someone to become willing, but you can choose willingness for yourself. You can say, "I don't understand everything yet, but I am willing to try." You can say, "I don't know exactly where this will take me, but I am willing to take the next step." You can say, "I am afraid, but I am willing." You can say, "I don't like what I see in myself, but I am willing to change." And perhaps that is enough to begin. Because the person who is willing can learn. The person who is willing can grow. The person who is willing can ask questions. The person who is willing can accept guidance. The person who is willing can repair. The person who is willing can serve. The person who is willing can recover. And perhaps one of the greatest dangers is not making mistakes. It is becoming unwilling to learn from them. A mistake can become a lesson. A failure can become an opportunity. A painful experience can become wisdom. A past addiction can become a reason to help another person. And that is where service becomes so important. Because recovery becomes even more meaningful when we stop asking only, "What can I get from this program?" and begin asking, "What can I give? Who can I help? Who can I encourage? Who needs to hear that recovery is possible? Who needs someone to listen? Who needs a person who understands?" The alcoholic who once felt useless can discover purpose through helping another person. And perhaps that is one of the great paradoxes of recovery. Sometimes we begin finding ourselves when we stop thinking only about ourselves. Service can pull us outside our own thoughts. It can remind us that our experience has value. It can transform suffering into something useful. And it can create a sense of belonging. But how it works also reminds us that recovery is not something we complete once and forget. It is a way of life. The work continues, the inventory continues, the need for honesty continues, the need for spiritual growth continues, the need to repair relationships continues, the need to remain teachable continues. Because complacency can become dangerous. A person can have years of sobriety and still become trapped by resentment, pride, fear, or isolation. That is why the principles must continue beyond the initial transformation. Recovery is not, I did the steps, so I am finished. It is, I am going to continue practicing these principles in my daily life. That is how the transformation becomes permanent. And perhaps this is where the true meaning of how it works becomes clear. It works when we work it. It works when we become honest. It works when we become willing. It works when we take action. It works when we stop trying to manipulate the process and begin participating in it. It works when we accept that recovery is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming progressively more honest, responsible, useful, connected, and spiritually awake. And perhaps, after everything we have discussed, the most important question is not, does the program work? The deeper question is, am I willing to work the program? Because there is a tremendous difference between knowing what recovery asks of us and actually practicing it. We can read about honesty, but eventually we must tell the truth. We can read about forgiveness, but eventually we must let go of something. We can read about service, but eventually we must help someone. We can read about humility, but eventually we must admit that we were wrong. We can read about faith, but eventually we must trust enough to take the next step. Knowledge can inspire us, but action transforms us. And perhaps that is the final message we should carry from this chapter. Recovery begins when willingness becomes action, not tomorrow. Not when everything is perfect, not when we feel ready, but with the next honest decision, the next meeting, the next conversation, the next apology, the next act of service, the next sober day. One day at a time, one decision at a time, one principle at a time, one step at a time. And perhaps someday when you look back, you will realize that the life you once thought was impossible was built through all those small moments when you chose not to return to the old way. You chose honesty, you chose sobriety, you chose responsibility, you chose humility, you chose connection, you chose service, you chose life. And perhaps that is what how it works ultimately teaches us. The miracle is not simply that a person stops drinking. The deeper miracle is that a person learns how to live. They learn how to face themselves. They learn how to face other people. They learn how to face life. They learn how to face pain without escaping into alcohol. They learn how to accept what they cannot control. They learn how to take responsibility for what they can change. They learn how to ask for help. They learn how to help others. And slowly, day after day, they discover something they may have forgotten. They are capable of becoming different. Their past may always be part of their story, but it does not have to be the final chapter. Their mistakes may never disappear, but they can become lessons. Their wounds may leave scars, but those scars can remind them how far they have come. And the person who once believed that life could never be different may eventually become the person who gives hope to someone else. That is the power of recovery. That is the power of willingness. That is the power of action. And perhaps above all, that is what How It Works is asking from each of us. Not perfection, not certainty, not a promise that we will never struggle again. Just the willingness to be honest, to keep moving, to keep growing, and to keep taking the next right step. Because the new life does not appear all at once. It is built, day by day, choice by choice, action by action. And one day you may look around and realize you are no longer simply surviving your life. You are finally learning how to live it.